The following is a presentation of the ILR School at Cornell University. ILR, advancing the world of work.
Good afternoon. Welcome to ILR's online webcast of disability inclusion across the employment process. I'm really pleased you're joining us this afternoon. I'm Linda Barrington, the Associate Dean for Outreach and Sponsored Research here at the ILR School. And today's webcast is going to be looking at the policies and practices around people with disabilities. October is Disability Month. This year's theme is #InclusionWorks. And so we're going to be looking at some of the research that our own Institute for Disability, the Yang Tan Institute on Employment and Disability, has done, as well as speak with a couple practitioners and leaders in the field who are really pushing forward on these practices to make inclusion work. So with me today is Susanne Bruyere, who is our director of the Yang Tan Institute for Employment and Disability, John Hausknecht, associate professor in our Human Resources Studies Department, and we'll be joined by a pre-taped interview by Abby Maladano, who's at Pinterest, as well as Beth Daly-Torres live via Skype. So when we think about the employment process, we understand that the outcomes that happen in the labor market are really forces that are really a combination of reactions to lots of forces. We have individual opportunities, we have employer practices, we have regulatory policies. When we think about what's happening in the US labor market right now, it's been a year where we've been struggling to keep up the momentum we had been building. So the last year we've really seen unemployment hovering around 5% and can't quite break out to push that down farther and increase opportunities in a broader way. That said, the labor market is still relatively strong and we've definitely recovered. But the recovery's also taken place more at the high end and the low end of the skill distribution for jobs. So when we think about the context in which we're trying to create more opportunities and inclusion for talented workers with disabilities, we're doing so in a little bit of a stagnant but not weak, moderately strong labor market, but with this hollowing out of middle skill jobs. And so we really need to look at the composition of the type of skills that are most in demand right now. So that's sort of where the US context is. But I know, Susanne, there's been recent changes on the regulatory front, both sort of international regulatory pushes as well as domestic. So tell us a little about how that's changed this past year, where the momentum is, and what the Yang Tan Institute has been looking at in that context.
Absolutely. We've been working really on two fronts. One is nationally, for sure, and also globally. I'll talk a little bit about both of those for a moment. At closer to home, we have had in the last 2 years a real push to assist federal subcontractors who are responding to the regulatory changes made by the Office of Federal Contract Compliance Programs that asks our federal contractors nationally to step up to a target goal of 7% of the workforce across all job categories being people with disabilities. And in response to that, we have certainly been working with many federal subcontractors, which makes up about a quarter of the American workforce totally, who are interested in improving recruitment and self-identification among their existing employees who are persons with disabilities. And on the global level, the UN Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities that came into place in 2008 has a increasing following every year, now 160 signatories, and we see a greater request among multinationals and partners who we have made in Singapore, in Europe, and also in India, who are interested in using the policies and practices from our research to implement a stronger program of disability inclusion in those countries as well.
So we've got those regulatory changes, we have the labor market forces, and then we also have what companies are doing to drive inclusion. So, John, when we talk about the employment process, we talk about recruitment, hiring, metrics, diversity and inclusion, career development, accessibility, comp and ben. We'll be talking more about those throughout the webcast. But what's happening within the HR practice? What are the trends that we're seeing around inclusion, but also just human resources overall?
Sure. So I think one of the things that you're seeing, particularly around metrics and analytics, is the proliferation of data being available to companies around targeted efforts to recruit, retain people with disabilities. So it's part and parcel to this broader trend over, say, the last decade or so of companies investing more in technology and systems to collect information on employees and really do deeper analysis of what it is that leads to successful recruitment efforts, retention efforts, and so forth. So I'll say more about that later, but kind of at the most basic level, I think you're seeing a lot more interest in the tracking and reporting and then analysis of information on employees, in particular people with disabilities.
So when we think about that, we've sort of put metrics off to the side here, but obviously it flows through all of those. So Susanne, can you talk a little bit about how we think about this model that we've put up here, thinking about all these different pieces of the employment process and really what it means in terms of including and providing more opportunities for employees with disabilities?
Absolutely, Linda. When we have been looking at disability inclusion for a number of years now, more concertedly in the last 5 to 6 years, we've looked across the employment process. The figure that we're sharing with our audience today represents the key cluster areas of where we have seen employers do best if they focus on throughout the employment process. Recruitment and hiring. John and you have talked about metrics and analytics, which weave throughout all of this. Career development and retention, the diversity and inclusion, accessibility and accommodation, and compensation and benefits. And we'll talk a little bit about each of those today and how companies can take a look at themselves and what they're doing based relative to the good practices that we've been able to identify as a part of our research, and also share resources and online tools that help companies to track these things if they choose to do so going forward.
So I'm going to push a little bit, John, on this issue of metrics in the world of people with disabilities, because it sounds like on one hand we have a lot more data available, but how important is it then to be sort of slicing and dicing it by sort of subpopulations of our employees, and in particular with people with disabilities? If you're trying to target a particular subpopulation, how do metrics play into that?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think it's, if you look at the history of doing metrics and analytics within HR, you can find metrics going back decades to just get a sense of how the workforce is performing overall, or the makeup composition of the workforce. And then you start to see deeper analysis to cut those metrics by employee populations or subgroups. And so we'll see in a minute here a slide that shows how this has evolved in terms of companies now tracking different metrics by the subpopulation of people with disabilities, and you'll see that the prevalence of that is much weaker compared to more traditional subcategories such as gender, race, age, and so forth. So to me, it seems like the progression has been, let's measure aspects of the workforce overall, let's look at certain subpopulations and cut our data differently to do targeted recruitment, retention efforts, and so forth. So to me, this is a positive development, although the representation isn't quite there yet with some other subgroups. I think you'll continue to see that grow over time.
So Susanne, do you want to talk a little bit about this slide where, there's quite dramatic difference in the percentage of organizations who from this data who said they track these differently. So
yes, and the background of this data is our partner has been the Society for Human Resource Management over a number of years, and this was a survey of SHRM's membership, which is a subset of their 275,000 members. We took a subset looking across industry, size, and across sectors to ask them across a number of things that we're going to share with you today. But here, metrics. What are they doing metrics for people with disabilities? And how does that compare to those protected groups, others that they keep more prevalent statistics on here? For example, here, gender, race, and ethnicity. And as John commented, far fewer companies, from what our HR professional survey respondents told us, keep metrics on these areas. And yet we know for them to be able to progress across that employment process and do something that's more disability inclusive, they're going to need to keep track of what they're doing. So we're hoping that our conversation today will encourage you to take a look at what you're doing in this area and begin to do better about taking a look at how you can translate metrics you've been keeping for other protected groups to this population as well.
So do you expect this to change with some of the new regulatory or governmental pushes on
we
this?
We definitely have seen that, Linda. That's an excellent question. Both, it has been true in the federal sector, which has similar sort of targets, but definitely in the private sector for federal contractors who now have a target for them to try to approximate. And so we see more companies trying to ask their employees and their applicants who are people with disabilities to self-disclose so that they can begin to count and know how they're doing across all these parts of the employment process.
So what I think is really interesting here is it's not that we don't know how to do the metrics by subgroups. We've been doing that all along. All the practices are in place. There's just a new subgroup that has really been underrepresented in the way that we analyze the workforce, and that new government incentive is actually making an impact in terms of people trying to expand those tools to the whole array of the workforce. So.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and I would just say what's important about this work that Susanne and others have been doing is kind of getting the word out there about how you might do it. And I think companies have maybe had interest in tracking some of these issues, but didn't know exactly how to capture it, or is it okay to capture it? Is it required to capture it? Those types of questions are now being answered, and I think that'll help increase these numbers over time.
Great. Well, we wanted to go to our first guest, who is coming to us from a pre-taped interview. Susanne, do you want to introduce
Sure.
Abby?
Our first guest speaker, who is going to be sharing from a pre-recorded interview, is Abby Maldonado, who we're very proud to say is an ILR school graduate, one of our own, who graduated 2 years ago. And Abby and I got connected. I went out and had an opportunity to visit her in Pinterest and to see what they're doing. So we asked if we could capture something from Abby directly, talking about what Pinterest's interest is, what's the business case for affirmatively recruiting people with disabilities, and if she could give us some tips about what they're doing and why they think it's important. So we will turn this over to Abby's interview.
For Pinterest, diversity has been something that's really critical from the beginning, and is actually one of the aspects of the company that really attracted me to work here, is that they were really thoughtful about bringing people in who are currently underrepresented. And so while most of our efforts thus far have really focused on women and underrepresented ethnic minorities, we recognize that diversity can mean many things, including people with disabilities who happen to be very underrepresented from what we know in the tech industry in particular, and across the workforce. And I think for Pinterest, it's really been about how can we make sure that we're leveraging the unique perspectives that are going to help us build a product for everyone. So that's kind of like the core kind of like business case behind it. But we also just have this general philosophy that diversity is, critical to, helping us become the company that we want to be, being inclusive, being really thoughtful about the different types of groups that we accommodate. I feel like we're very early stages and still learning a lot in this space, but right now what we're focusing on is making sure that the environment that people come into, or that is going to make Pinterest attractive, is actually welcoming to people who come from different backgrounds, and particularly for people with disabilities. I think a lot of times in the tech industry, there's this, notion that tech offices have to be like very flashy and very, open workspace environment, very collaborative, and trying to be really thoughtful and create different spaces for people who that might not be where they're most productive and where they're going to succeed best. One area where we think that we've seen progress being made in our other diversity and inclusion efforts is making sure that we actually understand the state of the industry and what our current numbers look like. Because one thing that we saw in the area and thinking about race and gender, which has been kind of the core of our diversity efforts, is once we knew what the numbers actually were, which groups were sorely underrepresented, then we were able to kind of expose those and make progress, because you can't really fix what you don't measure. And we haven't been doing a great job of measuring, our employees with disabilities. We might not even know certain employees that might have a disability. And so I'm thinking a lot about how can we be really thoughtful about how we ask employees, and then how do we make them feel safe in self-identifying and having a disability. There are a lot of resources out there, and kind of once you take that leap and understand that, and there's a lot of people that are willing to teach you, and there's a lot to learn. I also think once you kind of dig into this and understand kind of the state of people with disabilities even in this country, you'll realize, wow, there really is actually a strong pipeline of talent that we're completely missing by not focusing specifically on recruiting these types of individuals. And I think one area, and this is true of kind of all diversity efforts, if you're not intentional about your efforts to go out and find these specific populations that are underrepresented, it will not happen. And so you have to really be intentional about making sure that you are including all groups, or we'll just end up with these very homogenous workforces that aren't going to be super productive. So yeah, definitely you have to be intentional, and then there's a lot of opportunities to learn, and a lot of people in community organizations, in colleges and universities who are really excited to teach folks in organizations about this work so that we can get those who are currently underrepresented more represented in the industry.
It's around the business case, the way Pinterest sees the business case. And then thinking about this need to identify qualified talent. One of the points, though, that is the challenge in that is this idea of how people are going to self-disclose and when they self-disclose. And that sort of plays out both into the how do you recruit and attract and retain that special talent, but then also how do you do metrics if they haven't self-disclosed. So Susanne, what kind of things are we seeing around the challenges on self-disclosure?
I think companies are doing several things, which I think we're learning from, and I think we're able to promote more good practices around. One is getting community partners, which Abby does talk about, and that is the value of actually identifying community partners that can be a feeder for people with disabilities, qualified talent that really they understand your industry, they understand your company, and so they do a good job of training and picking people who are a good match. You then, in working with that community agency, know that you have a population, a talent pipeline of people with disabilities. So that helps on the front end. The other side of it is making people comfortable, particularly your own employees with non-obvious disabilities, and self-disclosing. So that has to do with workplace culture, and we'll talk a little bit about that in another clip, and a few other sharings about the information from our survey research about what companies are telling us about help there.
Yeah. So what about the issue of culture and metrics? Do you find that some companies are just more comfortable doing metrics because it's part of their business, or how do you get a company comfortable with it if they're not?
Sure. No, I think you do see wide variability in how kind of the maturity level of an organization in terms of using reporting and acting upon data and metrics. So, to me, it seems as though if the business already is very data-driven and heavy on metrics and analytics, then it's much easier next step to look at workforce analytics and then do this kind of analysis by employee subpopulations and so forth. So, if you have a strong marketing analytics group and they're segmenting your customer base, then those concepts and frameworks are pretty familiar to folks. And then I think where it's maybe more of a challenge is where the HR folks are not already comfortable with data and metrics, and then this comes up and they sort of don't know the legal ramifications. They're not sure how to manage the data, what to do with it, how to act upon it. So there's certainly a spillover, I think, from the organization's culture around using data or being data-driven.
Mm-hmm. But in that sense, then, if HR can get itself comfortable, it can help sort of grease the wheels of the culture for the rest of the organization.
For sure, right. And sharing of information sort of becomes routine then, and managers start to pay attention to it and see this as an imperative along with the other things that they're managing towards.
Yeah. So, Susanne, I know the Yang Tan Institute has done some of this metrics in terms of saying what impacts hiring across multiple companies. I think, John, you would say you then need to look within your own company because what may work for one company is different than another. But across companies, what are the practices that you all have identified?
This too, we're going back to the work that we did in partnership with the Society for Human Resource Management is a summary of the part of this survey where we asked companies what they're doing in terms of a number of good practices in the hiring and recruitment area. And what we found is then that certain practices were better predictors of whether or not the companies would have hired a person with a disability in the last year. And the figure here that we're sharing with our participants in today's webcast shows the results of that. If a company had reported internships for people with disabilities, they were 6 times more likely to have hired a person with a disability in the last year. Similarly, strong senior management commitment, when that's articulated, 5 times more likely to have hired a person with a disability. And on down this list, explicit organizational goals, where there is a target for hiring people, means that it's 4 times more likely, 3 times more likely if you're actively recruiting, not surprisingly. If you have diversity and inclusion that includes people with disabilities, sounds like a simple thing, but it really makes a huge difference, both in terms of attracting talent, people feel wanted and they're more likely to apply. And also, lastly, we just talked about relationships with the community organizations. Significantly heightens the likelihood by almost 3 times that companies would be successfully hiring people with disabilities over the last 12 months.
And that's in terms of hiring. So
Right.
then when you think about retention and advancement, though,
We
it's
also
little
learned
different.
a lot about good practices there. We similarly had a list of good practices and asked our survey respondents about what they were doing. But here I want to share what they thought was most effective across a whole list of practices. They told us having a disability-focused employee network was critical, and we're going to hear a little bit from Abby again about that. Having a return-to-work program or disability management program that supports your incumbents, your employees who are already there and may have a health-related or disability-related break from work, getting them back in a timely way. Having flexible work arrangements for all employees, not just people with disabilities. We all need a little flexibility every now and then. And also having a mentoring program that supports employees with disabilities. Mentoring's good for everyone, so we're not necessarily saying have a specialized program, but making sure that you reach out to your employees with disabilities and encourage them to take the next step in career advancement, so they're supported in doing so.
Great. So we've got another little bit from Abby at Pinterest, and we're going to turn to that now, and then we'll come back and continue our conversation.
I think a lot of the culture preparation that we do is just trying to educate employees to, again, like help prevent them feeling that awkwardness where they just kind of shut down and shut it out. I think my advice would be, don't think of it as totally separate from your other diversity and inclusion efforts. Think of it as something that is just one aspect of the work that you're trying to do to build a more diverse and inclusive workplace, and really recognize the unique perspective that people with disabilities are going to bring to your organization. If you are trying to build a product or you have a service that might include a customer base of people from different backgrounds, including those who might have a disability, having those people on board at your company providing insight is going to be critical to the business success. So I would say definitely make sure that your diversity and inclusion efforts are inclusive of all types of diversity. And then my second piece of advice would be just really try to focus on better understanding what your workforce makeup is in terms of all types of diversity. And that doesn't just include race and gender, but making sure you're creating an environment where people feel comfortable self-identifying that they have a disability, so that you can make sure that you're addressing those employees in a way that you're providing them with the proper accommodations and making them feel included and valued. One final thing that I want to point out that we're thinking a lot about and that we're working on is creating an employee resource group, or an ERG, for employees with disabilities. So we have these for some of our other underrepresented groups that are kind of more visibly underrepresented. So we have one for Black employees called Blackboard. We have one for our women at the company called Women at Pinterest. We have one specifically for engineering women. And then we also have one for our LGBT employees. And so these are communities that kind of they're supported from the top of the organization. So each of them have an executive sponsor. and they make sure that the needs and the issues and the challenges that these groups might be facing because they are underrepresented are represented at the top level of the organization. And so making sure that people have a community can also be a way to attract people to join Pinterest who might be differently abled, and then making sure that once they're here, they feel included and valued, etc. So I think one of the most challenging aspects of this work is it's very sensitive and it's very personal. And so making sure that people feel comfortable bringing their whole selves to work and making sure that they feel comfortable kind of self-identifying. Because again, if we don't actually know what employees might be experiencing, or if they, are an employee with a disability, how can we kind of make sure that we're accommodating them correctly?
So I thought Abby's second clip gave us a really great setup to a couple questions we have coming in. So Abby made the point of people feeling comfortable to bring their whole selves to work. We have several questions that all connect to the issue of mental health and anxiety. So clearly that seems to be an area that more people are tuned into these days, are paying more attention to. So we have one question that specifically asks, how that it's understandable that people with a mental illness may be more likely to not want to self-disclose. How do we make that population of employees more comfortable? And then a related question is, if certain groups of the population don't self-disclose, what does that mean for our metrics, right? Like, how does that play into the analysis we're trying to do? So, Susanne, do you want to pick up on this first question just around mental health, anxiety, and self-disclosure?
Sure. We are getting many more questions around the whole area of mental health. This has been a long-standing concern for companies because they don't feel often, or nor do their supervisors feel well equipped to deal with disabilities, often in general, but particularly mental health disabilities. So it really is an important area for us to learn more about with companies and help to educate. We often, it's a two-part thing. Part of it is, I think, letting people know that they'll be accommodated. The more that companies can send the message that they want people with disabilities in their workforce, like diversity, having disability in the diversity statement, affirmatively recruiting, people are more comfortable on the front end disclosing. But also, sometimes people wait until they're in the workplace because they want to be sure that that isn't a way to minimize the likelihood that they'll be hired. And I think that's also understandable. I think companies can send positive messages, and that will heighten the likelihood people are comfortable. But I also think they need to, once people are in the workplace, because mental health is on a continuum, many of our workforce members have stress-related experiences during the course of their time in the organization, is be prepared to support people when they have these kinds of issues. It will significantly heighten the likelihood they feel comfortable asking for accommodation and disclosing.
Yeah. So, John, what about the metric side of that? How do you adjust for that, deal with that, or is it just going to always be a deficiency in our analysis?
I mean, what's interesting about this development is that if you look at some of the other categories that we talked about earlier, so race, sex, age, and things like that, they are measured pretty accurately and fairly reliably for the entire organization. You may have some miscodings and errors in that sense, but here we're talking about a situation, as the commenter mentioned, around self-disclosure and what that's going to do to the measurement. So we're probably, in terms of base rate issues, trying to get the number right. Still have a little bit of work to do to understand what the true prevalence of persons with disabilities might be in an employee population. That said, I feel like, and we're going to see some data on this in a moment, there are some factors that increase the likelihood of a person disclosing that they have a disability to an employer, so we'll take a look at that in a minute. But from a data and analysis standpoint, I would think that starting somewhere with the tracking and then checking your data and trying to understand how accurate and reliable it is the first step. And then as this progresses, we'll get better clarity around some of the different measurement options and how they might promote the disclosure.
So, and Susanne, so do you want to talk about that a little? Because I know this is another
Sure.
area that you've done research around.
We definitely have, because in response to questions like the ones that our participants today are giving us, we have looked more deeply into across organizations and within organizations to try to find out how we can support companies and individuals in crossing this area and feeling confident to ask for accommodations and disclosing they have a disability. And we find that the manager's role is absolutely critical. People are 60% more likely to disclose to a supervisor or a coworker than they are to HR or any formal system. So it's very important that our managers are educated and feel confident in being able to ask the questions, have those dialogues in a way that's not threatening to the individual and that they feel comfortable with. That means giving them the resources that they need to do that.
And I know, on that point, I know we have some anecdotal evidence that employees are even more likely to disclose if it's an anonymous employee engagement survey that they're already doing. I know with a couple of the companies that you've worked with, when they added self-disclosure as a self, part of your demographics on the employee survey, that they ended up getting multiple times
Absolutely.
the counts or the numbers of employees with disabilities than they knew according to their official records.
That's absolutely right. Sometimes 3 to 10 times the number when then it's a survey that they feel confident that they won't be tracked back to them. And if companies have engagement surveys and it's always been a part of the practice and a disability item has been added, it's far more likely that they'll be able to comfortably accrue that data, comfort from the level of the individual who is sharing that information. So that helps immensely. We also found that the motivation behind companies accruing this makes a big difference in the perception of the managers. If it's clear that it's a part of the strategic imperative and the affirmative outreach, part of the diversity, it's far more likely that people will feel comfortable disclosing, that managers will take it to heart, than if it's just seen as purely compliance. So it's also, I can't stress enough the importance of the quality behind, the value behind what's shared with the manager about the rationale for it.
Right. And you had in a couple in the data that you did where there were some clear strongest factors that were contributing to why someone would disclose.
And this figure that we have to share today is from a different source. The other, it was still from some of our company input, but this is actually from the voice of individuals with disabilities. We surveyed 600 people with disabilities, and we asked them what would be the factors in the workplace that would heighten the likelihood that they'd feel comfortable disclosing. And about 2/3 told us if they needed an accommodation, they would be more likely to come forward. So having an accommodation process that's very clear, a point person, a process that people feel comfortable will significantly help. And having supportive supervisory relationships is also a reason to come forward. If people see people with disabilities, again, being affirmatively recruited, disability in the diversity statement, and what they perceive to be a disability-friendly workplace, all of these factors heighten the likelihood that people will feel comfortable coming forward.
So we're very happy to welcome our second guest. Beth Daly-Torres is the Vice President of Global Diversity at JPMorgan Chase, and I'm going to let Susanne bring her on with us.
Well, I just want to let everyone know a little bit more about Beth. Beth and I have been in conversation over many, many months. Beth has been a remarkable source of input to all of our deliberations about the design of our online tool that we're going to share with you later today, and what's good practice across this array of the employment spectrum. Specifically, Beth's going to talk with us today about what they're considering in terms of developing their talent of persons with disabilities within the organization. We thought that was the perfect thing for Beth to share with us. So Beth, it's all yours.
Hi. So actually I'd like to start a little bit about, talk a little bit about our recent journey around disability inclusion at JPMorgan Chase. So within the last 6 months, we founded what we're calling the Office of Disability Inclusion. And the point of establishing this office was to really dedicate and centralize resources that could specifically focus on elevating the level of disability inclusion in across our workplace at JPMorgan Chase. And we've got so in the Office of Disability Inclusion, we have 4 pillars, so 4 strategy pillars that we focus around, and we call them the 4 A's. So there's attitude, accessibility, accommodations, and assimilation. and this will relate back to Susanne, to the introduction that you that you just delivered. So this very much ties into the conversation that's been had so far. For the first A attitude, that really focuses on, it's the culture, right? That's the culture piece. So we're working on trying to make sure that employees with disabilities, people with disabilities, find the climate and the culture at JPMorgan Chase, one that is accepting, that is inclusive of people with disabilities, and that they feel like to use the phrase you used earlier, that they feel like they can bring their whole selves to work, that employees with disabilities feel like they can be authentic in the workplace. But the attitude piece also really focuses on making sure that everyone across our environment, our HRBPs, our managers, our employees, our recruiters, that everyone has the tools that they need to act in an inclusive manner. So that's a big focus for us in the attitude pillar. Accessibility really focuses on a lot of the messaging, again, making sure that tools are pushed out into the environment so that our employees are aware of what's needed to make the environment and the tools that people use on a daily basis, make sure that is accessible. Accommodations get to what was mentioned earlier around making sure that if someone needs something to get their job done, if they need a productivity tool, that one, they can get it, but two, they can get that in a timely manner and with a process that doesn't feel onerous. Because again, to Suzanne's point and Linda's point earlier, if it feels like it's a sluggish process, if it feels like it's really difficult to get what you need to get your job done, you're not going to feel good about being in the workplace. And that's really that's the piece of the culture that we're I think is extremely important. And then lastly, our fourth A, we're calling assimilation. And by assimilation, what we mean is that we're trying to shift the paradigm around disability inclusion so that we're having more conversations around advancement and making sure that when we bring people that have disabilities into our workplace, we're not just talking about getting people jobs and are we keeping people in the environment, but we're talking about, well, now what, right? So are we bringing people with disabilities into our workplace to have conversations around a career, right? To actually have that sort of that career conversation. And that's really what the assimilation piece is. The assimilation piece is, let's get people with disabilities into leadership positions, make sure that when we are long-term, when we're looking at metrics, when we're having conversations around metrics and disclosure, that we're thinking about ways to measure how our people with disabilities are being included in leadership conversations and leadership considerations, right? Because that's something that we don't hear a lot of companies talking about today yet. I'm hopeful that conversation will be shifting. But part of that really does get back to the metrics conversation around how can you actually start to not only have your employees with disabilities disclosing to you in the workplace, but actually able to identify them enough that you can ensure that they're getting incorporated in all the other people practices that you have across the board, right? So high performance conversations, leadership conversations, advancement conversations, development, however you might be approaching that. But to make sure that your people with disabilities are part of that, they're included in those conversations.
So Beth,
that's really, that's where we're at today.
I think the focus on the leadership development and career development is really sort of, you're kind of on the cutting edge of that, right? I think at least from the meetings I've gone to involving employees with disabilities, it seems like there is a lot of focus around the recruitment, around retention, but not quite on the development. I would think some of that is that it might be harder to do the kind of analysis of what really is successful in that way in the metrics. But also linking it to the strategy. So can you just sort of give me the elevator pitch for why in JPMorgan Chase's case, the development of leaders is so important to your strategy that it would be something your organization would focus on?
Sure. So we as a firm have we really do have. We are very committed to being kind of the best in class, or like the place that people with disabilities would like to come work. And when you think about like all the conversations all the pieces of the conversation for the last 45 minutes, it focuses a lot on why would people with disabilities want to come to your work? How are you going to attract talent? How are you going to recruit talent? And a lot of that has to do with who's at the top. It's the messaging, it's the tone. And for people with disabilities, I think it has to do also with being able to look up and say, wow, okay, there is a person, boy, this company must care. It must be an environment where a person with disabilities can succeed and thrive. So when you look at a person like the head of our Office of Disability Inclusion, Jim Sanaki, who is a quadriplegic, I think that it's very important. It's very important that a person with a disability could look upwards at their top ranks in the organization, or at their management, and think to themselves, well, my manager could be a person with disability. So it's shifting that conversation. So it's less about should we employ people with disabilities, and more thinking about that it's not unusual to think about, boy, my manager could be a person with a disability.
So really, it's sort of, your assimilation feeds back into your attitude, right? It's that when you get the assimilation, that is what changes the attitude.
Yeah, it's absolutely full circle, and I really think at the end of the day, right? And we've heard this before, but it's about talent, and it really is about innovation as well, because it's especially accessibility, things like accessibility conversations. When you have to step back and think about the way you've done stuff for maybe it's been the same way for a long time. When you have to step back and look at that way of doing things, you have to sort of pull it apart a little bit and think, well, wait, does that work for everyone? Sort of re-examine all your different steps and think about how you're doing things and who your clients are and who is your audience, and are you actually hitting the mark? That forces you in a lot of ways to be more innovative. And so I think really this really is about a talent conversation.
So if you had to advise someone who's still struggling with getting upper management support, what would you advise them? How can you turn the minds of those who can put this kind of program into place?
Well, so it does take, you do have to have senior management support. I think there are a lot of good resources out there around talent, right? Around just the looking at the skill base and the talent that's out there today, right? And that we're missing. That if you're not going to recruit people with disabilities, you're missing a big chunk of a large it's a large group of people that you could potentially be bringing into your organization. I think that itself is important. There are some good studies that have started coming out that look at just generally look at the population of people with disabilities, some information that wasn't out there before. It's good to have just those metrics. I think that if people are the inclusion element it's really a differentiator. So I think that's another part of the business case for those in their own industries who are looking to be leaders. This is a good leaders within their industries. I think this is a really good way to differentiate and put themselves at the front of the pack. I think that alone is a strong part of the business case.
Right. Everyone at the top of the organization wants to. It's a strong selling point to help make them a leader in their industry, and you're doing that.
Absolutely, because there are not a lot of organizations today who are talking about developing talent for their employees with disabilities, developing that talent into leadership roles.
Yeah.
So it is definitely a differentiator.
Well, we really appreciate the insight and you taking the time to join us today, and all the support you've done with all the other work that our Young Tan Institute's involved with. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Beth.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye.
So one of the points that I thought was interesting there was the importance of process, and that, I think we tend to always think of bureaucracy as a barrier, and therefore we don't try to do it. But the fact that if you can make processes less onerous it actually can help turn the table. And I wonder, is that a typical part of metrics, the sort of how long it takes to do this or that? And
Yeah, I mean, I think looking at the whole field of metrics and analytics, especially within a single organization, it's absolutely a journey over time, and there's some foundational work that has to happen around data governance and data definitions and getting support for the types of information that you might want to collect. And then it evolves into the analysis piece, and sort of over time people understand the results of that analysis. But I mean, we are talking years in some cases before this gets real traction, and it's seen as the foundation for how we make decisions based on data, if you haven't had that in the past.
so if you're trying to build not only the inclusion of people with disabilities, but new ways to track them, and really push on that career development, is career development and leadership development, again, something that we typically do with other populations, and it needs to just be expanded to include people with disabilities, or is that also sort of a leading edge and not everyone's there yet?
Certainly not everyone's there yet. I mean, you are seeing companies that are segmenting the internal flow of talent and doing these internal audits of how do people end up in senior leadership positions, be it internal mobility or external hiring, and then segmenting that. Well, what about if you cross that by age bracket or by generation or by some other employee subcategory? So you could imagine that work happening here as well. It goes back to an earlier question about the low base rate issue. If there aren't many folks who are self-disclosing, you don't have a whole lot of data on mobility or advancement, there's not a lot of information to work with yet. But as that becomes more robust, I think you'll see similar types of analysis, just as Beth mentioned, around how people are moving into, through, and out of, up through and out of organizations by this subdimension.
And I think that it's a tough thing to articulate, but one of the reasons that it is important for people to self-disclose is because then they sort of allow themselves to be put into the data analysis that will actually help us figure out what are the best ways to move people forward. So
That's right.
there is a personal benefit that can come from self-disclosing if it helps your organization do better analysis.
That's right, and I think, I mean, it's obviously a sensitive topic for people to want to self-disclose. It's not something that people are used to in a lot of cases, especially as we heard about different types of disabilities. But hopefully over time that stigma, if you will, becomes less and less, and then we, both employers and employees start to realize that this is all sort of moving in the right direction to develop programs or practices that are inclusive and supportive.
Right. So, Susanne, I know we have a wide range of implementation of various practices that are really supporting the holistic engagement. We've talked about recruiting and hiring and metrics, and now career development. Accessibility accommodation is another one. So we have issues around that. Can you tell us sort of what you're seeing in terms of who's doing what?
Absolutely. We asked our SHRM informants about these practices as well, and this is very much in line with what Beth was saying, that it's really important to have this kind of a process in place. And what we found is that where companies were doing some things, 3/4 of them have a designated office for return to work and to address accommodation questions. Far fewer, only 1 in 5, had a centralized accommodation fund, and yet we know that that significantly helps. So people, I think having the list that you see here and looking, self-assessing, what are we doing in this practice, the more of them that you're doing, it's going to heighten the likelihood that people feel comfortable coming forward and asking for that accommodation.
And I know you've also talked about just overall this idea of a centralized accommodation fund. That was also something that Beth mentioned, is them pulling together and making it a centralized point, because from the budget perspective, then you're not sort of, you're providing support to the units to do something on accommodation by taking the cost centrally. She also mentioned the having someone that they can ask. So that's also something you've found as well.
Yes, absolutely. What Beth articulated that JPMorgan Chase is doing is exactly in line with what we heard from our respondents in this HR survey, that they perceive to be good practice. The top 3 here you see on the figure: centralized accommodation fund, a designated person or office that people know, supervisors, individuals with disabilities, to go to, and having a formalized process so people know how to go about this, both the supervisory and the individual. Where do I go, and what do I need to do to get what I need to stay productive? So obviously we have a good example in JPMorgan Chase, and I'm happy to be able to affirm that that's good from the 600 people who responded to our survey. Would you like me to address?
Yeah, sure.
I think one of the things we really like to also let employers know is that we tend to make accommodation requests seem special when they come from people with disabilities, but the reality of it is employers are effectively accommodating all of the time, all of their workforce. And this is a survey from a national survey, this current population survey, that tells us that people with disabilities are actually in the minority of the number of accommodations, the types of accommodations that employers are doing all the time. 95% of accommodations come from people without disabilities. And so I think it's important for employers to realize that this is just a part of good business. They already know how to do it, and that accommodating an individual with disability, there may be some nuances, but in general, it's just keeping your workforce productive.
Well, and we have been receiving a number of questions related to self-disclosure. And I just wanted to mention that Susanne Bruyere and her institute will be going through all the questions. So if we haven't addressed yours specifically, as long as we have your contact information, we'll be getting an answer of some kind.
Absolutely. We
You'll
will
be
get back
reaching
to you
out
if you've
them.
given us the benefit of knowing how to reach you.
Okay. So one of the other things that you've done to help folks is to create what you're calling a benchmarkability tool around these different components of the whole employment process. Do you want to just mention that a little bit, what that is? And then perhaps, John, as we are sort of nearing the end, approaching 1 o'clock, just talk about what tools mean for a company and how they may or may not be able to help you take the next step forward. So.
Thank you. And I have to acknowledge that John has certainly been a partner with us in this process in the designing of the tool, but we have a 90-item online tool that allows companies to track across the 6 areas that we've had some discussion with you today. And so this is the website is up there. So we invite you. There's no cost to this, to come and use this tool. It allows you to self-assess across the 6 different areas in the employment process to take a look at how you're doing. And it's a collaborative tool, so you can send a request to your comp person, to your recruitment person, to your return to work person, and have them complete the different parts of it and pull it together into one tool, or have different parts of your organizations complete the tool so that you can take a look at different regional offices and how they're doing in terms of employment across the process for people with disabilities.
So I'm sure there's numerous tools out there on different aspects of metrics. So how do companies sort through that? How do they use them? Mm-hmm. Do they always develop their own? What's happening on that?
I mean, I think it's a combination. You know, there's certainly still a lot of interest in benchmarking against peers using a standard set of items or questions. And then you have the custom work that companies will do in analytics or in their survey work. So a tool like this sort of sits at the intersection of the two in a way that, if you wanted to start to build in more questions or more evaluation of the work that you're doing, this is, a fairly comprehensive and, well thought out, I think, from the work that Susanne and others have done. Look at where you might start to look at, inflows and throughputs and things like that of people through the organization in these different areas. So to me, it's a great resource and one that could be used, as Susanne mentioned, by going to the website. But even if you're just interested in doing custom work to get ideas about how, what types of questions might we ask? How might we link this to advancement and the retention piece? So there's a series of individual items that would help you think through in your organization. Okay, does this make sense for us? How could we track this? And then go out and maybe customize it a bit for your own work. But as an off-the-shelf tool, I think something like this is fantastic for getting the conversation started and having a baseline for how to look at this.
And that's often the most important thing, right? Getting the conversation started, because you have to start somewhere. We also have several lengthy slides here with related publications that may or may not be of use to you, but then some more accessible links to various tools and activities that the Yangtan Institute is involved with. So we're almost at our 1 o'clock hour. I'd like to thank you very much for joining us. But as we wrap up, Susanne, do you want to give a final sort of summary around what you guys are looking forward to in the coming year?
Absolutely. I want to thank our two guest speakers, Abby and Beth, for being with us today, and acknowledge that it's our partnerships with companies like Pinterest and like JPMorgan Chase that enable us to really understand what's happening in companies, learn from and leverage, and we're looking forward to continued relationships. We have a series of 6 short courses that will be going along with benchmarkability that we'll be releasing in 2 months. And we look forward to partnerships with companies to allow us to continue to iterate both the tools and the training so we're as useful as possible going forward.
Great. Well, thank you both for joining us, and thank you for joining us today. And we look forward to seeing you on a future ILR online series webcast.
This has been a production of the ILR School at Cornell University.